An anti-xenophobia group is calling for peace and tolerance. This comes in the wake of calls for undocumented foreigners to leave the country. Kopanong Africa Against Xenophobia is expected to march against intimidation and threats made to illegal immigrants. The march was supposed to take place last week, but it was prohibited for safety reasons. For more on this, we're joined by the group's Ferron Pedro. Ferron, thank you very much for your time this morning. And I suppose the cause that you're supporting or what you're fighting against makes it difficult when you've got operations like Dudula and similar operations that are seeking to clean up the country, as they would say, but really are committing some actions that are questionable.
Yes, I mean, even the rhetoric being used, clean up, I mean, as if there's an infestation. It's the classic racist and hateful rhetoric used by fascists and populists who are only interested in really exploiting legitimate grievances of people who are suffering under government policies, but who are misplacing their anger towards vulnerable migrants.
What would you need in terms of support to make sure that you are able to carry through the cause that you are promoting?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
What do you need in terms of resources and support? I know you were supposed to march last week, like I mentioned in my intro. You couldn't even do that. So the support and the resources that organizations like yours would need so that the plight that you are fighting for could be heard and could be received.
Right. I mean, so we have been supported by SERI, who have assisted us with the court case against the JMPD. But really what's happened is that government, the JMPD in particular, and it's not surprising with the kind of anti-migrant rhetoric coming from the top, have really gotten in the way of our perfectly legitimate right to protest. They've asked us to pay 10,000 Rand to be able to exercise our constitutional right to protest. So, I mean, what we'd really like is for people born in South Africa, locals and migrants, to come together and find solutions to the problems we're facing without government at least getting in the way of those kinds of initiatives.
Right, and you also have to battle with issues of social media and the fake news that goes around there about foreign nationals, whether they be here illegally or legally.
Right. I mean, there's a huge amount of misinformation and fake news, incorrect statistics, all, being posted on social media to foster hate. We know that misinformation leads to prejudice and inflames tensions and inflames xenophobia. So we've seen that a lot on social media. But what we've noticed is that it's actually a small number of people that have a very big presence on social media. We don't believe that most South Africans are xenophobic. We know that most South Africans are suffering under high unemployment rates, diminishing or crumbling public infrastructure and public services are being reduced by the state. And we have to work together to fight that. And what's happening is that those grievances are being inflamed and misdirected towards migrants who are not to blame for the problems that we're facing.
That's very interesting because many would argue otherwise. So how do you reconcile the fact that many South Africans are arguing that these foreign nationals, whether they be legal or illegal, are taking our jobs? They are starting businesses where we could be starting businesses. You know, there are various arguments, and it's really difficult to reconcile because you see the reality, and then there's the argument that actually they are not to blame for what's happening in the country. It's the inefficiencies of a government from a local point all the way through national.
100%. So, I mean, how do we fight the misinformation? With the truth? We have to be constantly the beacons of the truth. And there's clear research and there's clear facts around some of the misinformation. For example, the Home Affairs Minister saying that there are 15 million undocumented migrants at one point. That's simply not true. You know, at most there are 5 million migrants in South Africa, and many of them are documented, which wouldn't constitute the 46.9% unemployment rate that we see and 70% youth unemployment, right? There are way too many unemployed people for migrants to be the reason why people are unemployed. Similarly, around crime and you know, criminal syndicates in the country. Of course, there are foreign criminal syndicates, and we oppose them like we oppose all crime, because who suffers most from that? I'll tell you, migrant communities and poor communities suffer the most from that kind of violence and crime, and would also oppose crime of that nature. But the fact is that most people in prison are born here, are South Africans. So it's wholly misstated and based on anecdotal and incorrect evidence that you know, migrants are to blame for crime, migrants are to blame for drugs. That is just the kind of anti-migrant sentiment and rhetoric that comes from the top, that makes that allows government to scapegoat migrants for its own inefficiencies and its own failures.
So with that, do you think that enough has been done by government to integrate migrants, particularly those who are undocumented, into society so that they can become contributing members of society, in that they get jobs and they work and they contribute to the economy in terms of circulating income? I'm only asking this because I did a story about migrants living in South Africa and the hardships that they go through just because institutions like Home Affairs are unable to provide them with documents. And it's not because they just they can't. It's a matter of incapacity. They don't have capacity, and they also have major insufficiencies that leave people literally in limbo for years even.
Right. And I mean, you're making a really good point, because when we're marching today, we're marching not just against xenophobia, but we're marching against the roots of xenophobia. And some of that is the cuts in budget for the cuts in public spending. So Home Affairs has been totally incapacitated to deal with even people who are born in South Africa who are undocumented. So most people that are undocumented in South Africa are actually born here, right, in rural areas, or just not able to access their birth certificates and their ID documents. So there are huge backlogs when it comes to managing, you know, Home Affairs. And then, of course, there's as a way to scapegoat migrants again for the inefficiencies, there's a serious anti-migrant rhetoric and anti-migrant policies coming from the top. So the refugee office, and I think xenophobia in some of our leadership, right? So the refugee office has been closed for 2 years, purportedly because of the pandemic. We know that this is just a way for government to cut costs and to blame, again, migrants for its failures. So it's really around, when we're marching for basic services, like making sure that Home Affairs is capacitated, but also making sure that our healthcare services are capacitated. Joburg General Hospital has been closed now for over a year, and people are complaining about healthcare in Johannesburg, but and blaming migrants. But it's gross mismanagement on the part of the Department of Health to not make sure that there are enough hospitals and hospital beds, that Baragwanath Hospital is, you know, that there are enough doctors and nurses and, you know, food for patients at that hospital. And the same thing with schools. So these cuts in spending, budget cuts and austerity, are directly linked to the kind of hatred and social tensions that are arising and are being inflamed by groups like Operation Dudula.
Thank you very much for your time. They have been speaking to Ferron Pedro. They're speaking about what they are calling for in terms of peace and tolerance for migrants living in South Africa, something that we are currently grappling with, what with the advent of the likes of Operation Dudula and so.